Good morning and welcome to today's SANS webinar, Security Operations Center, Ill-Equipped and Unprepared, which is part 3 of 4 of the Rekt Casino Hack Assessment Operational Series. With us today, we have Mark Orlando, who is a SANS instructor and an author for the new Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. If you have any questions during the webcast, please use the Q&A and we will moderate those at the end. And at this time, I turn it over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone, and welcome to part 3 in our 4-part operational leadership series on the Rekt Casino hack. So today, we're going to be talking all about security operations. And if you've been following this series, and if you haven't, don't worry, I'm going to get you up to speed. You know that the Rekt Casino is a fictional organization that was recently hacked. Unfortunately, the scenario in which Rekt finds themselves today is not all that fictional. It's rather realistic for many organizations out there. We'll talk about the details of that hack. And today we're going to talk about this incident and where we go from here through the lens of security operations, and more specifically, the Management 551 Building and Leading Security Operations Center course that Laura mentioned. We'll also pull in some lessons from the other course I teach, which is SEC 450, Blue Team Fundamentals and Security Operations. So we'll talk a little bit about the Rekt hack from those two perspectives. Now, before I dive into that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. As Laura mentioned, I teach both SEC 450 and Management 551. I am the co-founder and CEO of Bionic, which is a blue team focused cybersecurity services firm. I have about 20 years of experience in security operations. I've worked in or built or managed or led security teams of various shapes, sizes, and sectors in the public sector, at the White House, the Department of Energy, several other federal agencies. I've also spent many years in the managed security services and managed detection and response space, working with a lot of different customers and clientele there. I was also the CTO for Raytheon's cybersecurity business. So I've looked at very similar problems from a lot of different angles, but always from that blue team and security management perspective. So you can hear me opine and occasionally rant about various topics in that vein on Twitter at Mark A. Orlando if you're on there. But all that said, let's jump in and talk about Rekt. Now, again, whether or not you've been following the series, Rekt Casino was the target of a major attack and subsequent data breach. So here's what happened. Rekt Casino, again, a fictional organization, was a 20-year-old company, fell victim to a ransomware attack, right? Pretty common in today's headlines. This resulted in a lot of damage, not the least of which is the compromise of lots of sensitive data. We've got personally identifiable information, HR records, financial data, all of that stuff was exfiltrated. And in responding to this incident, we discovered that the root of the problem is really a systemic failure of the Rekt Casino to pay proper attention to cybersecurity risk for a pretty long time. So no governance, risk management, compliance considerations really being paid, lack of inherent security aware culture, no technical or administrative controls. So really a lot of work to do, no security program to speak of. So for most of us, that's probably not much of a surprise that this happened, right? We also know that Casino up the street went through a very similar ransomware attack previously. So that's an interesting data point. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And we engaged a third party, another organization, to help us work through this incident, as often happens. Okay, so parts 1 and 2 of this series dealt with doing some of the hard things, right, to kind of make up for this 20 years of not paying close attention to cybersecurity. So some of my SANS colleagues talked about vulnerability management, getting your arms around what you have, what state it's in, what risk you're exposed to based on the vulnerabilities in that infrastructure. Last week, my colleague James Tarala talked about implementing the critical security controls. So laying the foundation, right, for resisting this kind of attack. And he talked about ways that we could avoid this sort of attack in the future by implementing some of those fundamental controls. So fortunately for us, right, we've done a lot of the hard things if we're kind of following this down that path of getting our arms around vulnerability management, implementing some of those basic security controls, right? So more or less we're good, right? The incident happened, we're doing the hard work now, all good, okay? Not so fast. So reading up on the original case study, in the Rekt Casino, we had 3 IT professionals wearing multiple hats. And this is effectively your Rekt security team, right? So you have 3 fractional experts who are supposed to do all of the security work. Everything from risk management to vulnerability management, right, to deploying and maintaining and monitoring security controls. That's a bit much for 3 part-time people, right? Fortunately, Rekt has decided to invest in a security operations center to shore up its defenses, right, address some of these remaining gaps, and identify evidence of other compromises. Because let's face it, we've had a lack of basic security controls here for quite some time, right? Going back decades at least. We're still not able to identify the root cause of that initial foothold, that initial malware infection. So the reality is there are probably other incidents happening in the Rekt environment right now. Now, they told us that, we can sort of create whatever narrative we want that fits within the scenario. So for me, I'm working for Rekt Casino. I just picture Robert De Niro pulling me into the counting room and telling me that if I don't build out the security team and do something about these breaches, like right now, he's going to sick Joe Pesci on me with a baseball bat in a cornfield. And I don't know about you, but that's plenty of motivation for me to do all the things that we need to do. Now, when it comes to building out a security team, we obviously can't do everything at once, right? It takes a long time. Any of you who have built up any kind of security capability, right, know that it's not just about slamming some tools in there, hiring some people, right? There's education involved, right? It's an evolutionary process. It takes a lot of time. So the things that we want to kind of keep as our North Stars here, which are really threads that kind of run through this whole webcast series, are we need to understand what the threats are. We need to learn from those threats. We need to understand what our risks are, right? And learn from those. Okay, and we need to carry that knowledge through into deploying the proper defenses, right? Effective, tailored defenses, and taking action when we see something that kind of slips through those defenses, right? Something that we don't expect. Right? We need to have a plan for when that's going to happen and know what we're going to do when we identify the next ransomware, the next data breach, right? So building out a SOC has a lot of different moving parts. But from the perspective of preparing for the next incident, or maybe preparing to identify the next incident that's already happening within the Rekt environment, we're really talking about a couple of different things. Obviously, we want to deploy security controls, tools that give us the visibility that we need to identify the next incident before the data breach happens, before our adversary achieves their objective, right? So we need to get the right telemetry so we can identify, scope, contain intrusions. We need to do some hardening, right? Prepare our environment to resist intrusions as much as possible. Now, we all know that prevention is ideal, but eventually it's going to fail. Now, obviously, we got lit up in this scenario, but even organizations that have deployed vulnerability management, that have implemented the critical security controls, that have robust security teams, right, they still face some of these same kinds of risks. These sort of breaches and infections, still happen. So when prevention eventually fails, right, We just need to buy ourselves enough time, right? Make it expensive enough for the attacker so that we have more of an opportunity to identify that activity and respond again before the damage is done. So a lot of that comes down to a lot of the things that James talked about in last week's episode about deploying some of those basic sort of foundational security controls so that we can resist intrusions, or at least buy ourselves some time, give ourselves an opportunity to identify that activity at multiple different stages of an intrusion like this one. We also need to do some planning around process. Right? When we identify these intrusions, when we see something like this going on, what do we do in that scenario? And then finally, this is my favorite one, practice, because it's so often overlooked. Now, we can deploy all the security controls that we want. We can do all of the planning that we want. Right? We can hire all the people that we want. If we don't practice and we don't kind of drill these processes into the team, identify weaknesses, improve those processes so that we know they're going to work when it really counts, right? Then it's kind of all for naught. So I'm going to come back to that a few different times today, just to talk about, really giving you as a security leader, as Rekt's new SOC manager, maybe, or security executive, right? Giving you the confidence that the things that we're doing, the things that we're deploying are going to have the desired impacts, right? We're going to be able to sleep at night. We only have to worry about Joe Pesci showing up, occasionally, right? But practice, practice, practice. We're going to talk about how we do that. Now, at a high level, this is what our SOC is going to look like. Now, we're going to have a team that's going to be doing technical stuff, right? We'll talk about what that stuff is in a few minutes. But if we took kind of a 30,000 foot systems level view of the SOC, this is kind of what it looks like. We've got some key inputs here in the form of threat intelligence. This is really just what attacks look like. We kind of have a front row seat now for what attacks look like. We know very well, at least for one specific kind of attack, what it looks like. And then there's environment data. This is information, machine data that comes from our internal environment, generated by our security tools, right? Generated by user reports, things that we observe or understand about our environment. A lot of that is going to come out of the things that we talked about in parts 1 and 2 of the series: vulnerability management, deploying those critical security controls, right? Getting things like hardware and software inventory. Those inputs go into the SOC, where we use a variety of different tools and techniques, right, to fuse that information together, give us a complete picture of what's going on, and then the output of that activity is resolved issues, right? We want to solve problems, not just monitor alerts for the sake of doing that, but the output of the SOC should be identified, minimized, remediated incidents. Right? And more importantly, we want to be able to go back and look over time and say, here's where we were 6 months ago when this breach happened and we decided to stand up our SOC. Right? Here's some of the things that we were able to put out from the SOC, right? Issues we were solving, or at least gaps we were identifying. And then today, right, here's how we've evolved. Here are the gaps that we've closed, the incidents we've remediated and won't be revisiting, right? Because we've kind of taken action to close those gaps or to improve our visibility. So again, input, what attacks look like, what our environment looks like. We put that together. We do a variety of different monitoring, analysis, triage, investigative processes. We identify incidents, and then the output of the SOC are those remediated incidents, solved issues, improvements in our environment. Now, the flip side to this is that if we have poor visibility in our environment, we're not doing the kind of tough foundational things. If we don't really have good information about what attacks look like, what adversaries or what types of adversaries are likely to be targeting us, right, we're not going to get good outputs. It's the old garbage in, garbage out kind of problem. Okay, so something to keep in mind as we start on this SOC build-out journey. Right? This is really what the process should look like, and it really depends heavily on those two inputs. Now, within that black box, where all that SOC work is happening, We're going to have a core tool set. Now, we do work for a casino. Hopefully, they've got some money to spend, right? But like any organization, resources are finite, especially in security, right, where we're a cost center. Okay, fortunately, we've got a pretty good business case for why we need to make some investments. And here are some places where we're most likely to start. Core tool sets would include things like a security information and event management system or a SIM. Most of you probably have one of these. This is where all of that great machine data, the logs, network visibility, host visibility, right? We're going to consolidate all of that, overlay our understanding of attacks, right? Either by feeding threat intelligence into it, creating detections, all that logic, right? That gets overlaid on top of that machine data. And the output should be reliable, actionable security alerts. Might want to look into a threat intelligence platform, some place that we can take all of this understanding, all of this threat intelligence, right, put it together, perform our analysis, identify links, decide what's relevant to us, decide what kind of context we want to add to our environment data, right? Whether that is a dedicated threat intelligence platform technology or a function that's part of our SIM or another tool, we want to be able to have a place to do that work, right? We need to also have a place to track our investigations. Okay, remember, we're building a team here. We want the team to be able to work together, to share information, to hand off investigations from one analyst to another, right? All that's going to happen in an incident management system of some kind. Okay, and while we're on the topic of capturing and storing information and knowledge, when it comes to overlaying those detection use cases on that machine data, say in our SIM or in some of our point security tools, okay, we're going to be doing that through use cases. So let's think about this incident as it happened. We had ransomware infection, right? Probably had some lateral movement as an attacker sought out, new machines to infect and encrypt, sought out some of that sensitive data, very likely consolidated some of that data or staged it in some central location so that they could prepare it for exfiltration. So lots of different detection use cases in there, from the initial infection to file encryption to lateral movement, staging, exfiltration. All of those are detection use cases, right? And another often overlooked element in the SOC is capturing and documenting and tracking these use cases. This is really where you're going to get that value back out of your tools, right? Your tools are only going to be good as the use cases that you're applying to them, right? So we need some place to track and document those use cases. We also need a place to store unstructured information, a knowledge base. So anyone who has hired a team of security analysts knows that you're going to have some analysts that are very highly skilled, very experienced. You're going to have some newer analysts, right? Probably going to have a wide variety of different skill sets and expertise and experience levels, right? So how do we even that playing field so that we're sharing that expertise across the team and kind of elevating everybody, right? And not just relying too much on one or two sort of key team members. One of the ways we do that is by having a knowledge base that's easy to use, well-structured, searchable, and available to the team. So that's another core tool set. And then finally, think about the Rekt environment. 20 years with no security monitoring, right? No governance. Who knows what that environment looks like or how clean it is? It's probably kind of the Wild West in there, right? So the last thing that we want to do is deploy all of our new fancy core tools for the SOC, where we've got all kinds of sensitive, juicy security data. We're tracking everything we know about threats and about our investigations, right? The last thing we want to do is toss all of that into kind of the dirty cesspool that is likely to be the Rekt network environment, okay? So setting up a private enclave, private ops network, in an environment where we can safely analyze evidence, artifacts, things like that, that's going to be a key part of this core tool set as well, right? So these are kind of our starting points in terms of technical tools and capabilities that we're going to need in the SOC, right, just to get going, get the bare minimum of what we need. And now it's time to prepare the environment. So again, we covered bits and pieces of this, and in fact, quite a lot of it in parts 1 and 2 of the webcast. But the bottom line here from a security operations perspective is that we want to start the long journey towards least privilege, right? Or if you want to be really cutting edge, right? Zero trust. The point is we want to take away unnecessary access, unnecessary capabilities, monitor what's left, right? That is a long and sometimes arduous and time-consuming journey. Here's kind of what that looks like. On the network side, okay, remember, we want to narrow the avenues of opportunity that are available to our attackers as much as we possibly can, right? Control inbound access. We know that in this particular case, if you were able to read the Rekt case study, we were not doing any kind of outbound filtering. So all of that sensitive data, all that PII and financial data marched right out of our network front door, and there's really very little we could do about it. So tightly control inbound and outbound access, implement some robust network security monitoring. So whatever is left, whatever communications are still happening, we've got a good view into that. On the host side, we want to restrict those internal to internal communications. One of the biggest risks when it comes to ransomware is once that initial foothold happens, once the attacker gains access to your environment, okay, many strains of ransomware will propagate through the environment, right, or encrypt whatever they have access to. Or if an attacker gains a foothold, they're going to attempt to move laterally, right? Obviously, we don't want that. We want to restrict that internal to internal communications. And we want to implement continuous security monitoring or host-based security monitoring using host IDS, host IPS, endpoint detection and response, those kinds of controls. We also need to lock down the application layer and the identity layer. So this means deploying some kind of app control, application control tool, right? Lets us restrict what applications can run only to the things that we know should be running in the environment. Okay, and that's really tough, especially for an organization as old as this one. Right? People are probably running all kinds of stuff, especially in a casino environment. There are probably a lot of custom applications, things very specific to that business that an off-the-shelf tool may not be familiar with. Right? So we can use something like Windows App Locker or similar app control tool, maybe put it into auditing mode, right? Just so it starts alerting, we start to get a sense of what's happening in the environment, plan someday to put that into blocking mode, right? Try to lock that down. On the identity side, carefully set our permissions, secure those credentials and monitor their use, especially when it comes to elevated privileges, admin groups, admin credentials, set up privileged access workstations, right? Where anyone who is using elevated privileges, permissions, right? They do it on a specific dedicated workstation and not the same machine they're using to browse the internet, do email, and other occasionally insecure activities, right? So this is just scratching the surface. The bottom line here is we need to start this journey toward least privilege, right? And it is a very long journey. So at the very least, getting those network and host-based controls and that visibility in place, probably the best starting point for our fledgling SOC. But what about the other input? We talked about threat intelligence, right? What exactly does that do for us? And all too often, when I come into a new SOC or when I'm helping an organization build out a new SOC, getting that threat intelligence feed or that third-party service is often really high on the list. And I'm a big fan of threat intelligence partners and data feeds, right? Those are great, but there's a lot more to it than that. At a high level, your threat intelligence should include a lot more than just feeds of indicators of compromise, right? Or static reports. It is the sum total of external research that your analysts are going to be doing, internal incident information, again, the data that you're collecting from your own environment. You're going to take all of that information and you should be able to sort it into 3 different buckets. We have strategic threat intelligence, we have operational threat intelligence, and we have tactical intelligence. The difference your strategic intel, these are going to be the things that your leadership is probably most interested in. Right? Who are the adversaries? Why are they attacking us? What do we have that we need to think about securing? Right? What are our risks at a very high level? Operational threat intelligence is more about tactics, techniques, procedures, industry trends, things that are maybe specific to our organization, not quite down into the weeds. Right? At the tactical level, that is down into the weeds. This is where our new SOC team is going to be spending most of its time, consuming tactical threat intelligence, which are these indicators of compromise with context. So for example, we saw this command and control server. It was used on this date and this kind of attack. Right, that's important contextual information that our analysts can use to go hunt for similar activity in our environment, cite other sightings that we may not have identified. Now, whatever bucket your threat intel gets sorted into, what we're trying to get to here is an accurate threat model. What do our adversaries want? How are they likely to get it? On the SOC side, on the tactical side, we want to build better detections, better analytics. Right? What does this look like in our environment? How do I go find it? Excuse me. And ideally, boiling this down into its most basic level, right? We want better preventative measures based on a threat model. Right? Here are sensitive assets. Here are people that are probably after those sensitive assets. Right? Let's jam them up as much as possible. Better preventative controls and better detections where we can't prevent everything. Right? Now, wait a minute. We just had a massive incident. So fortunately, or unfortunately, we actually have a lot of this information today. We've got some external research. Remember, another casino just up the road was targeted in a very similar attack. Could it have been the same adversary? Certainly the same kind of adversary, probably, right? We've got internal incident information. Remember, Rekt brought in a third party to respond to this. What kind of artifacts have they found? What other tactics, techniques, and procedures have they uncovered? Right? And in parts 1 and 2, we worked on deploying some additional security controls. We worked on our vulnerability management program. Right? So what kind of visibility, what kind of data are we getting from our environment? Right? We have a lot of these pieces. So let's learn from them. Right? How can this support a more accurate threat model? Things that we should care about. Paths that attackers are likely to take to get into our environment and do what they're trying to do. How can we detect those things? Right? Got to make use of that information. Now, drilling down into a slightly more tactical view of what this process might look like, right, is what we have here. So all the way here on the left, we've got our threat intelligence. Remember, that's IOCs plus context, right? Information about similar attacks at other targets in our same sector or industry, information about our internal environment, what our vulnerabilities are, right? We can put that external intelligence into some additional context by classifying it according to threat group. Right? And we can do that largely using open source information, right? We can do some research, some Google searches even, right, to kind of try to understand, at least at a high level, what kinds of adversaries routinely target the gaming industry, routinely target casinos, routinely employ ransomware, do data exfiltration, right? Identify those tactics and techniques. We can use frameworks like the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, right, to enumerate those TTPs. Now, I'm a big fan of MITRE ATT&CK. It is not a checklist or a be-all, end-all catalog of all the possible attacks that are out there, right? But what it does allow us to do is take that high-level threat intelligence and tie that to very specific TTPs, which we can then map to specific data sources. So this is where we start to take those high-level inputs, the things that we've learned, however incomplete, and actually tie that to the real hands-on work that we're doing, building out the SOC, building out our monitoring, that SIM, that threat intelligence platform in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. For the TTPs that are cataloged there, MITRE has included data sources that you can use to identify those TTPs. So that gives us kind of a roadmap and a framework to prioritize the data that we might bring into our SOC, that we might bring into that SIM. Based on the visibility that those data sources give us, right, we can develop better detections, and therefore we have better capabilities. Now, I want to pause there for a second. Let's get real, okay? One of the worst parts, maybe not worst, one of the most challenging parts of being a security leader, especially on the operations side, is going to bed at night knowing that you have invested all of this money and time and effort, right? You've trained your team, made all this investment, but you're not that confident that you're finding everything that needs to be found. You're not that confident, at least not 100% confident, that when the next attack happens, you're going to identify it. So defining exactly what your capabilities are, and I'm not just talking about, yeah, we have a SIM, so we'll check that box, right? No. As it's shown here on this capability mapping, you know, for this TTP, this technique, this specific tactic, these sub techniques, right? If that happens, will I identify it consistently no matter where it happens in my environment, no matter what flavor of that TTP, what variant, what, you know, sub technique is used, will I still detect it reliably, right? Most of us don't have that kind of confidence. And that is, it's disconcerting, right? And that's a tough part of what we do. So defining, measuring capabilities in that way across your environment consistently, you know, that's the really hard part. Right, so we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, of course, when we identify those incidents, we have to take action, right? And this is where our incident response comes in. Now, whether we are going to house the incident response capability entirely in our new SOC, or make it a separate team, or maybe keep this third party kind of on board on retainer and have that hybrid sort of incident response capability, whatever the approach, okay, we've got to lay that foundation first by defining policies. Right? What is our policy around you know, security, around incident response, proper use, what's allowed, what's not? We'll make a plan based on those policies, right? What's our plan to enforce those policies or to take action when the policies are violated? And then based on that plan, we've got a series of specific step-by-step procedures. Those are our run books or playbooks or IRP, whatever you want to call it, right? Specific processes, techniques to use in the event of an incident. Now, you can see here the incident response process as it's described in NIST Special Publication 800-61, version 2, revision 2, excuse me, which is preparation, which we've talked about quite a bit already, preparing the environment, preparing our team, getting the telemetry, the capabilities that we need in place to then detect the incident, analyze, scope it, contain it, eradicate it, restore the systems to their original state, and then the all-important post-incident activity, which is kind of what we're in now, right? What did we learn from this hack? What are we going to do better next time? You know, really this entire series, to some extent, is about this post-incident activity. And the key here is this sort of cyclical motion that whatever we learn, right, we take that back into our preparation activities. What are we going to do better next time? What did we not do this time that might have prevented some of this from happening? Now, there are some really cool projects and open source tools and frameworks that are out there that are kind of based, at least in part, on that MITRE attack matrix. One of them is the RE&CT framework. And if you Google RE&CT spelled this way with the ampersand in the middle, you'll find it. It was developed by a team of researchers, and it is a very cool kind of spin on MITRE attack. Whereas MITRE attack describes different attacker TTPs, different attack types, RE&CT defines different defensive tactics sort of aligned to that: prepare, identify, contain, eradicate, respond, lessons learned, okay? broken into response actions that, much like the TTPs, the tactics and techniques in MITRE ATT&CK, they each have unique IDs, have a description, and other sort of metadata associated with that. So you can see here, this is an excerpt from the RE&CT framework. And what this allows you to do is, if you're using ATT&CK to guide some of your research, some of your threat intelligence, you're classifying TTPs according to ATT&CK, maybe you're classifying incidents and tagging them according to ATT&CK and sort of mapping your capabilities to that, you can overlay, right, what defensive tactics you have on top of those same TTPs. Okay, if you're using something like MITRE's Navigator app, which I highly recommend, it's super cool. RE&CT has resources to allow you to create additional layers so you can visualize how your defensive tactics will overlay and map to different attack TTPs. So again, this is a way that we can take very high level understanding and awareness of attacks out in the world, in our industry, or that have happened in our specific environment. Take information from those attacks, map them to specific capabilities, and then map those further to defensive tactics that we can take when we identify those TTPs. And here's kind of what that looks like in that attack navigator view. You can do all kinds of cool color coding and sorting and measurement of those capabilities. One of the coolest things about Management 551, and probably one of my favorite labs ever, is it's actually a series of labs in the class. We start with a very high level activity where we create a kind of a high level threat model. Who are the adversaries that are likely to target us? What TTPs are they likely to use? And then we kind of walk through highlighting those using MITRE Attack Navigator, and we create kind of this matrix of not only what are the TTPs we're most likely to see, what mitigations do we have in place, where are our gaps? And it's a really easy way, again, to sort of tie all these things together, knowing that we can't do everything at once. We do have to prioritize certain things, right? And this is just a good framework, a tool that allows you to do that. And that's something that we do in class. It's a pretty cool lab. Now, RE&CT is also great for playbook creation, right? So based on these response activities that we might take, right? We've got to build processes. We got to help our team understand what to do when they see these different types of attacks, these different TTPs. So RE&CT is also a great starting point for writing some of those very tactical kind of procedures and processes, things that you want your team to do. The RE&CT project and the resources that come with it, it's all free, open source, comes with task lists for an incident response platform. It comes with a Confluence page template. So if you have a knowledge base, if maybe you're using something like Confluence, it's got ready-made templates for that to describe playbooks. A lot of really good operational resources there. And so I want to sort of tie this off by talking about validation. So remember, I talked about being kept up at night, not knowing how well prepared you were for the next incident. Right? Maybe not even being totally confident that you would even detect an incident if it occurred. And that's really kind of a fundamental driving question for a lot of security operators, in my experience, is, we've got all this stuff, but is it really going to work the way we want it to work when it's crunch time? Okay, we failed this time. We don't want to fail the next time. How can we be confident that that's not going to happen? And the way, the way that we do that is through continuous testing and validation. Now, fortunately, this is an area that I think has gotten a lot more attention in the last few years on the blue team side of things, which is fantastic. So whether we're doing atomic testing for different detections that we're writing, I'm going to write a detection for persistence, right? Using this specific kind of TTP, this specific technique. So let me try to do that technique, see if my detection fires and works, right? That's kind of the most basic unit testing type of activity that we can do, something that we can do starting almost immediately after we deploy our tools. Once we're a little bit more mature and we have some more of these capabilities stood up, we can do something like purple teaming, right, which is a little bit more of a real world kind of feel. The blue team and the red team sits down, virtually together, and they go, step by step. Red team conducts a test. Blue team sees if they detected it, and then we sort of lock it down, maybe go a little quieter, see if we can still detect it, and sort of enumerate different tactics and techniques that way, confirm that we can reliably and consistently identify them. It's a great training activity, a great way to, again, give us some of that confidence. Going a little bit further down the maturity scale, Rekt probably isn't ready for this just yet. We just had a free pen test conducted by some attackers, so I don't think we're quite ready for another paid engagement. But you can do things like red team, which is very high realism, usually unannounced. This is a good way to test your detection and response. All the way to adversary emulation. This is usually focused around very specific goals or emulating a very specific adversary. Scope is usually a lot broader than in a red team engagement, usually a lot longer. But again, if you're a very mature organization, maybe down the road, once we've built out our risk management, our governance, deployed that first cut of tools that we want to deploy, and we're feeling pretty confident in our ability to identify and respond to intrusions, then it might be time to do some of these more kind of late stage validation activities, red teaming, adversary emulation, those kinds of things, right? So this is how we sleep better at night. This is how we're going to be able to demonstrate to Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci at Rekt Casino that, hey, we're doing everything you asked, right? No problem here. Give them the confidence that they need, right? That the investments they're making in our new security operations team are paying off, and that we won't fall victim to this same kind of attack this same way next week, next month, next year. Okay. So to summarize, responding to this incident as we have done, right? And any incident for that matter, whether you respond well, whether you respond poorly, that's really just the beginning of your journey, and certainly the beginning of our journey here at Rekt, right? We need to think about what we learned from this and what we can do better, which happens to be quite a bit in this case, okay? Reference frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, right? Or sort of similar kind of related frameworks like RE&CT, they are not a checklist or a be-all, end-all, but they can help us avoid starting from scratch. They can provide great sort of reference, kind of guides for how we can prioritize and address the most critical tactics and techniques, gaps, lack of capability, right? Address those things first. Threat intelligence, right? We absolutely should be using it to prioritize different threats, prioritize things that we want to try to identify and respond to when we see them, and make sure that our capabilities are aligned to our threat model, right? Everyone's threat model is different. And certainly at Rekt Casino, for an organization like this, it has its own set of very specific concerns around things that the organization has to be able to do to create value, data that it cares about. Right? So our capabilities have to align to that. And threat intelligence is one of the very key inputs that tell us how we align our capabilities to those careabouts. And then finally, again, this is a journey. Certainly building and leading a security operations team is a process, right? It's not you build the team, you put them in a room, and then you're done, okay? Focus on getting the visibility you need, assessing that visibility, assessing your detection capabilities, benchmark that, see where you are, and then build from there, okay? Look to improve over time, but you have to get that initial benchmark, that initial visibility, that initial kind of recurring assessment in order to know where you are today and where you hope to be in the future. And with that, again, this is part of our operational leadership series. This one was based on Management 551. Previous parts were based on 516, vulnerability management, and 566, implementing and auditing the critical security controls. If you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2, I highly recommend you do that. They were really good. I actually learned quite a bit. And I will be back here next week at the same time with some of my colleagues, where we kind of come together, bring the different elements of this operational leadership triad together, and have a all new, all different discussion about how these pieces come together for this case study, kind of how we could improve, what we would do in this circumstance, bringing all these elements together as you would in a real enterprise security program. So with that, I want to thank all of you, and I've got some time here for questions, which it looks like we have at least a few.
Yes, we do. So thank you so much, Mark. The first question, what should mid-size firms that simply do not have the budget and headcount focus on, and what are they required to do by compliance regulations, for example, HIPAA?
Yeah, so certainly, a mid-size firm is not going to just be able to say, hey, you know what, we should definitely go build a SOC. So, let's drop a cool 1 to 5 million and, just get that done, right? Usually not an option. To your point, especially in a circumstance where you're subject to compliance regulations and you have certain things that you have to spend money on, right? So that's to some extent, that budget is already spoken for. As far as what they're required to do by compliance, of course, that's going to vary widely, but usually that comes down to being able to know what your data is and where it is, and deploying certain specific security controls, right? That sort of demonstrate best effort to secure that data. That being said, compliance, while it's necessary, does not necessarily mean you are secure. So all that being said, I would say for small or medium organizations, especially ones that have compliance requirements as well, focus on visibility first. At the very least, you want to know kind of what your issues are, know where your risks are. And I actually spend a lot of time doing this in my consulting work, just trying to prioritize those issues. We talked about going through the process of just creating a threat model, which you can do relatively easily using some of the frameworks that I talked about, and a little Google searching, poring over news articles and the like. You can build a rudimentary threat model. You can look at what you have internally, and you can try to get some of that visibility and start to prioritize things that you want to fix, knowing it's not going to be everything. So I hope that that helps.
Great. Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just reading the next one.
How do you get your company to shake loose money for tools and especially training when they haven't been hit yet and have their head in the clouds?
Great question. So, barring a massive incident like this one, which tends to shake all kinds of money loose, right? That's the way that we don't necessarily want to get investment. A lot of it comes down to, and I'm sorry, I don't have a more exciting answer than this, but putting your ask into a business case, right? Expressing that request in terms that the business understands. And usually that means money. So if you need tools, if you need people, if your people need training, what is the organization not getting or not able to do today, right, that they will be able to do when they make that investment? And then kind of the second part of that is, if they choose not to make that investment, right, and they don't have whatever capability it is today, what is it potentially costing the organization, right? Even if you have to express that in terms of, well, if we don't get this network security monitoring tool, here are all the threats that you are vulnerable to that we won't be able to identify. Here's what kind of impact, what kind of loss could potentially occur based on those threats, right? Again, most times in my experience, asking for money and resources, at some point you're going to get up to a management layer that really doesn't care that, well, we can do dynamic malware analysis, but I really need tools to do static malware analysis. They don't care, right? Express that in terms of, well, we won't be able to properly assess, this threat, and you're looking at this kind of damage, this kind of outage, this kind of impact to the business, right? That's kind of putting it into terms that they care about. So that's how I've been successful in doing that in the past.
Terrific. The next one may be better suited for the follow-up blog post, but you mentioned a couple of sites that could be useful. Can you post or add them?
Yes, absolutely. In the follow-up blog post, I'll include links to the resources that I talked about and others. So MITRE ATT&CK, Attack Navigator, the React project, we'll link out to all those tools and sites.
Terrific. Next question. How do we work on having visibility in an environment with cloud and remote workforce?
Visibility in terms, I'm assuming that is visibility into like network traffic, host-based activity, like technical visibility. So it can be a challenge, especially when we talk about cloud. Now depending on what your cloud service provider is, that's really going to dictate what kind of visibility you have, what tools are available to you. I would say for the remote workforce part, if you're heavily kind of invested in software as a service and cloud service providers where you don't have your users coming back into an environment that you can monitor, right? You got to look for ways to get that telemetry either through an API for that cloud service provider, through logs from that SaaS provider. Sometimes it's just kind of it's a battle. You got to do one at a time, just slog through, getting as much access to that data as you possibly can. Get that telemetry into your tools, figure out what's available to you, and where possible, it's not always possible, but where possible, as you're looking at security tools, building your detections, look at ones that work and play well with cloud service providers, with remote, distributed workforce. The reality is some security tools kind of work better in those sorts of environments than others. So more specifically, what kind of connectors, does it natively work in these cloud environments? Those kinds of questions are good ones to ask.
Terrific. What would be customary team sizes for Rekt or slightly larger firms? For example, 7 to 8 headcount currently without the SOC?
I love this question. I promise I'll give an answer, but first I'm going to plug Management 551. So I can't really share a lot about this, but let's say hypothetically that they were new management leadership class training things coming up in the near future, right? Let's assume that. If there were, I would expect that there are some really great hands-on exercises and content that specifically addresses this question of capacity planning and resource planning in the SOC, which is something that I have not seen a lot of. Not a lot of guidance of like how many people should you hire, like how do you plan capacity? It's really hard, but I think in something that I may or may not be working on right now, we're tackling that really well. But barring that, watch this space for more information on that. But barring that, it comes down to really you need to understand what your analysts are doing every day, how they're spending their time. So in this scenario, it would be you got to have a certain minimal head count, right? Whatever that is, certain minimal head count to keep the lights on, make sure the SOC is staffed. Once you deploy, let's say a SIM, right? The SIM is going to generate so many alerts. How many alerts is an analyst looking at every day? On average, how long does each alert take to triage, investigate, work, close out, right? And then you kind of multiply those variables together and you get, here's how many person hours it takes to handle all these alerts and do whatever else is happening in the SOC. Right? You have to assign a time value to those things and then see what you're dealing with. And either you're going to have far fewer analysts than you have person hours required, which means you either need to tune your tools, that's usually what the situation is, or you need to hire more people. But it's usually a factor of things that analysts are doing in your SOC times average time it takes to do those things equals person hours, and then you can kind of divide up those hours by how many people you have and see where you're at. That's very high level kind of how I approach that.
Wonderful. And the final question we have, how do you recommend approaching security operations for increasing SaaS use where company teams have decreasing visibility into the network since those networks are controlled by the application providers?
Right. So yeah, increasingly a huge issue. This is where it comes down more to things like identity and data. I know because I came from this world myself, and SOC, for a long time, we've been trained to think about things in terms of network traffic and host traffic. And those are really the two buckets. The reality is now, like in this scenario, it's not just about those things. It's about the application layer. It's about identity and access. So I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but the short answer is think about the telemetry that you can get into how user accounts are used, into authentication, into access to data in those SaaS applications. Those are going to be kind of your stock and trade when it comes to monitoring SaaS applications. So, at that point, there effectively is no network layer to monitor. And really, you don't necessarily care about the network traffic going to those SaaS providers, right? We care about our data and what's happening with our stuff in those SaaS providers. And kind of the keys to that kingdom are in the access credentials and how that data is protected. So I would just say, really depends on the SaaS provider, but think about that kind of telemetry, what you can get access to, and focus on that.
Wonderful. And with that, we are all done for the day. Mark will be posting a blog early next week for a follow-up on this, and he can address some of these questions in the blog as well. And we hope that you will join us next week for part 4 on Wednesday, March 24th, where the panel pulls this all together. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.